The year is 1347. A chill lingers in the autumn air as merchant ships drift quietly into the harbors of Europe. No one knows yet what they carry, only that the air feels heavier and the nights strangely still. Soon, whispers will spread of an illness unlike any other, one that will change the course of medieval life forever. But tonight, we are not here to rush through tragedy. Instead, let us walk slowly, gently, into the medieval world as it was, a place of simple rhythms, village laughter, markets filled with the scent of bread and herbs, and homes warmed by the fire. Before the plague, daily life followed the quiet turning of the seasons, and even in times of hardship, there was comfort in the familiar. In the coming hours, we will explore not only the story of the Black Death, but also the deeper rhythms of medieval life. We will move carefully through cobbled streets and wooden cottages, hear the soft echoes of church bells in the night, and learn how ordinary people, villagers, farmers, healers, and even kings, lived through times of uncertainty. So settle in, rest your head, and let your imagination drift as we travel back together to a medieval world touched by shadows, but filled also with resilience, tradition, and quiet strength. Before the shadow of plague fell across Europe, medieval life was guided by rhythms older than memory itself. Most people in the 14th century lived in small villages, scattered across green fields, dense forests, and winding rivers. These villages were simple in their layout, a cluster of thatched cottages arranged around a narrow lane, a church at the center, and beyond, fields divided by hedges and wooden fences. The sound of daily life was gentle and familiar. At dawn, roosters called across the countryside, and villagers rose from wooden beds or straw mats, stretching stiffly after the chill of the night. The day began not with urgency, but with quiet duty. A fire was stirred back to life, its smoke curling softly into the morning sky. Inside the cottage, the air was filled with the scent of rye bread slowly baking on the hearth and the earthy fragrance of dried herbs that hung from rafters. The walls were built of wattle and daub, coated in clay and whitewash, with small windows that allowed just a thin slice of daylight to spill across wooden tables. Life was humble, but it followed a comforting order. Farmers set out to tend their strips of land, guiding oxen through the furrows, planting wheat, oats, or barley depending on the season. Children carried small baskets to gather kindling or followed their parents into the fields, learning the rhythms of labor that had not changed for centuries. Women tended to animals, chickens scratching in the dust, goats bleating softly, pigs rooting at the edge of the forest. These were the sounds of security, the everyday music of village life. Meals were simple but nourishing. A thick pottage made from grains, peas, or cabbage bubbled slowly in iron pots. Fresh bread, coarse but filling, was broken and shared among the family. On feast days, the meal might be brightened with a little cheese, a jug of ale, or a rare cut of salted meat. Eating was less about indulgence and more about survival, but still, the act of gathering around the table brought comfort and familiarity. In the afternoons, the village came alive with small tasks. Blacksmiths struck their hammers in steady rhythm, shaping tools and nails, while women sat together spinning wool or mending garments. Children played near the churchyard, their laughter mingling with the low toll of the bell that marked the hours. Faith was woven into every moment. The village church stood as the tallest building, its simple steeple pointing to heaven. Within its cool stone walls, villagers prayed for good harvests, for health, and for mercy during hard winters. Priests led services in Latin, words not always understood but felt deeply, as chants echoed softly against the stone. At sunset, the pace of life slowed again. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, carrying the scent of oak and pine. Families gathered close to the hearth, sharing stories passed down through generations. Tales of saints, of distant kings, of strange lands beyond the sea. Children listened with wide eyes, comforted by the steady crackle of the fire. There was hardship, of course. Hunger when crops failed, illness when winters grew too long. But the structure of village life offered a sense of certainty. Each day began with the rising sun and ended with the quiet hush of night. Seasons dictated labor, but also gave meaning. Spring brought planting, summer the harvest, autumn the storing of food, and winter the stillness of survival. This was the world before the great pestilence arrived. A world of ordinary tasks, ordinary hopes, and the enduring rhythm of community. It was a life lived slowly, in tune with the earth, where every sound, every scent, and every ritual carried its own quiet meaning. And it is into this gentle world that the plague would soon arrive, uninvited, silent at first, yet powerful enough to alter not only life itself, but the very way people understood the world around them. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was deeply connected to distant lands in ways both seen and unseen. Caravans moved slowly along the Silk Road, carrying silks, spices, and jewels from the east. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean, their wooden hulls filled with cloth, wine, grain, and wool. Towns and villages that once seemed isolated were now part of a vast, pulsing web of trade and travel. It was along these very routes that the plague first made its way westward. Historians believe it began in the distant steppes of Central Asia, where the disease lived quietly among rodents. When merchants carried goods through trading posts and across mountains, the plague traveled silently with them, hidden in the fur of rats and carried by the tiny fleas that fed upon them. In 1347, ships from the Black Sea sailed into the harbors of Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. To the people on the docks, the vessels looked no different from any other. Yet inside their dark wooden holds, something unsettling had taken root. Sailors staggered ashore, weakened by a strange illness. Their bodies bore swellings, darkened and painful, and within days, many lay still, their voices silenced. At first, the sickness seemed confined to the ports. Villagers inland heard whispers of strange fevers by the sea, but such tales often drifted like rumors and faded into the air. But soon, the plague spread further, carried by traders along dusty roads, by pilgrims on foot, and by carts moving between bustling markets. What began as a whisper became a steady murmur, and then, in time, an undeniable reality. Medieval towns, with their narrow streets and crowded houses, were especially vulnerable. Wooden homes leaned close together, their upper stories almost touching. Livestock and people lived side by side, and sanitation was little more than throwing waste into ditches or streams. In such places, illness found easy passage. And yet, even as the plague moved from village to village, the rhythm of daily life continued. Markets still opened, church bells still rang, children still played in the dust of the streets. The people did not yet understand the nature of what was arriving among them. To many, it seemed like another passing sickness, harsh but not unfamiliar. Only with time would its weight be fully felt. The Black Death moved not in sudden waves, but with the slow, steady persistence of a shadow creeping across the land. It did not arrive everywhere at once, but rather unfolded like a dark tide, first touching the harbors, then flowing inland to cities, villages, and even the most secluded monasteries. It is easy, from the quiet of our present, to imagine fear overwhelming those who first saw its signs. But in truth, the earliest days were filled more with confusion than with panic. What was this new illness? Why did it spread so quickly? And how might one protect a family, a village, a community? As we move further, we will walk into those questions with the people themselves. We will see how they continued their lives as the sickness unfolded around them. We will linger in the homes of peasants, in the halls of merchants, and in the cloisters of monks, to understand not only the plague itself, but how medieval people faced it, with customs, beliefs, and rituals both familiar and strange. When the plague entered a village, it did not stop the turning of the seasons, nor the need for daily work. Life, even under its shadow, had to go on. Fields still needed tending, bread still had to be baked, and families still gathered at the hearth each evening, even as uncertainty lingered in every corner. Inside the home, changes became subtle but noticeable. Doors were shut more tightly, shutters drawn earlier against the night. Families shared meals quietly, sometimes with fewer voices at the table than before. The familiar scent of bread and pottage still filled the air, but conversations carried a tone of unease. A cough in the night, once ordinary, now drew lingering glances and whispered prayers. Food, too, became a reflection of the times. In villages where illness spread quickly, markets grew sparse. Some stalls stood empty, their cloth coverings stirring in the wind. Farmers brought fewer goods to town, and neighbors sometimes hesitated to share as freely as they once had. Still, meals were made from what could be gathered: cabbage and leeks from small gardens, beans and peas from storage, and the occasional fish pulled from the stream. Eating was as much about maintaining a sense of normalcy as it was about nourishment. Work in the fields continued, though with fewer hands to guide the plow. A farmer might pause, resting heavily on the handle of his tool, looking at the land that stretched before him and wondering if his neighbors would return to work beside him tomorrow. Children helped more often, carrying baskets, pulling weeds, or leading oxen slowly through the furrows. The rhythm of labor was quieter now, but it did not stop. In towns, shopkeepers sometimes closed their doors, not because they lacked goods, but because they feared the gathering of crowds. Blacksmiths, cobblers, and weavers worked in silence, their hammers and looms echoing in empty streets. Monasteries, once filled with the murmur of visitors and the clatter of daily chores, grew more hushed, their cloisters filled with the sound of prayer. Yet, amidst this quiet tension, life also showed its resilience. Families still gathered for evening meals, telling stories to children so that laughter might soften the heaviness of the day. Women still spun wool and patched clothing, their hands steady even as their hearts were uncertain. Farmers still sang as they guided their animals, soft songs carried into the wind, as if to remind themselves that life still held melody. Fear was present, but it was not constant panic. It was more like a shadow that lingered in the background, sometimes heavy, sometimes lighter. People did what they had always done. They worked, they prayed, they cared for one another in the ways they knew best. A healer might be called to a cottage to mix herbs and speak words of comfort. A priest might walk from house to house, carrying the soft murmur of blessing into homes that felt fragile. For most medieval people, the plague was not understood in the way we know it today. They did not see it as a disease caused by fleas or carried by rats. To them, it was something mysterious, perhaps a punishment, perhaps a test, or perhaps simply one of the many hardships that life could bring. And so, they responded as they always had, with rituals, with traditions, and with quiet endurance. The stillness of these days, though heavy, also carried moments of deep humanity. Neighbors checked on one another, even from a distance. Children still found ways to play in the lanes, their games offering small sparks of joy. And in the hush of evening, when church bells tolled slowly across the fields, families still gathered close, finding comfort in closeness, even as uncertainty lay outside their doors. This was everyday life during the plague, not always marked by drama, but by the quiet persistence of ordinary tasks, ordinary meals, and ordinary hopes. Even in times of shadow, the rhythm of life moved forward, soft but unbroken. When the plague spread through medieval towns and villages, people turned not only to their work and their faith, but also to the customs and remedies they had known for generations. In an age without modern medicine, illness was often explained through signs, humors, and unseen forces. To us, these practices may seem unusual, but to those living through uncertain times, they offered comfort, hope, and a sense of control. One of the most common beliefs was that the air itself carried sickness, a concept called miasma. People thought that foul or corrupted air, drifting from swamps or carried on the wind, seeped into the body and caused illness. To protect themselves, villagers sometimes carried sweet-smelling herbs like rosemary, thyme, or lavender. Bundles of flowers, called posies, were tucked into clothing or hung near windows, their fragrance believed to purify the air. Others turned to charms and small tokens worn on the body for protection. A piece of iron, a small cross, or even a handwritten prayer folded carefully into a pouch might be carried beneath clothing. These items were not only physical objects but also symbols of comfort, a way to feel shielded from the invisible. Healers and wise women mixed remedies from the herbs they gathered. Garlic, vinegar, and onions were thought to cleanse the body. Warm poultices were pressed against the skin, and potions brewed from sage or rue were offered in small cups. Some remedies were simple and soothing teas made from chamomile or mint, intended to bring rest and calm. Others were stranger to our ears. Powdered gems crushed into fine dust or mixtures of honey and exotic spices believed to restore balance. Beyond medicine, rituals played a deep role. Villagers might walk in processions through the fields, singing hymns to ask for protection. Bells were rung not only for prayer but also to drive away unseen forces. Fires were lit at crossroads, their smoke believed to cleanse the air and protect the community. Some customs were rooted in the balance of the body, the ancient idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doctors sometimes recommended bleeding or the use of leeches, hoping to restore harmony within. To modern minds, these methods may seem harsh, yet in their time they were seen as thoughtful acts of care. Superstitions also flourished. Some believed carrying coins of silver or wearing bright jewels could ward off illness. Others thought that strong-smelling substances, like vinegar-soaked cloths held to the nose, might block the corruption of the air. Even laughter itself was sometimes suggested as a cure, for it was said that joy could strengthen the spirit against disease. Yet perhaps the most powerful remedy of all was community. Neighbors prayed together, families whispered blessings over their children, and people held fast to traditions that reminded them of meaning beyond their struggles. Whether lighting a candle in a church, hanging a sprig of herbs above a door, or carrying a charm against the chest, these actions offered not just protection, but comfort. To the medieval mind, these beliefs and customs made sense in a world where the causes of illness were hidden. They were not empty gestures, but acts of resilience, ways to push back against uncertainty, to preserve hope, and to keep moving forward, one day at a time. And as the plague continued its slow journey through towns and villages, faith in these rituals, strange and familiar alike, helped people endure, giving them strength to face each new day with quiet courage. In medieval life, faith was not just part of the day, it was the framework through which people understood the world itself. When the plague spread across villages and towns, it was often seen not only as an illness of the body, but also as a test of the soul. For many, the first response was to turn to the church, to prayer, and to the rituals that had long given meaning to both hardship and joy. Every village had its church, often the tallest and most enduring structure. Its stone walls felt steady when so much else seemed uncertain. Within, candles flickered before wooden altars, their soft light reflecting off painted icons and simple stained glass. Here, people gathered to seek comfort, to hear familiar chants, to breathe in the fragrance of incense, and to place their hopes into words of prayer. Priests walked among their people, carrying blessings from cottage to cottage. They recited prayers over the sick and over those who had passed, their voices steady even as the world outside seemed fragile. The ringing of church bells, once used to mark the hours of work and worship, took on new weight. Each slow toll reminded villagers of both loss and the enduring presence of faith. Monks, too, played their part. In monasteries tucked among fields or perched on hillsides, their days were filled with prayer, copying manuscripts, and tending to the ill who arrived seeking help. The steady rhythm of the monastic life, chants at dawn, readings at midday, silence in the evening, offered a sense of order when chaos pressed at the edges of daily life. For some, even the thought of monks chanting in distant cloisters brought reassurance, like a quiet heartbeat echoing across the land. Pilgrimages became another response, for many believed that traveling to holy sites could bring healing or protection. Pilgrims carried staffs and wore small badges showing the shrines they visited, perhaps the tomb of a saint, or a chapel known for its miracles. These journeys were not easy, yet they were acts of hope, steps taken in the belief that devotion might shield both body and soul. Not all responses were the same. Some saw the plague as divine punishment and called for repentance. Processions were held, with barefoot villagers walking through fields and streets, chanting hymns and asking for forgiveness. At times, these processions carried both sorrow and beauty, long lines of candles glowing in the night, soft voices rising into the cool air. For others, faith was quieter. Families whispered prayers together at home, tracing the sign of the cross over their children. Mothers taught old hymns as lullabies, their voices blending comfort with devotion. A simple wooden cross carved by hand or a rosary passed from one generation to the next became cherished protections. Religion in this time was not only about seeking answers, it was about finding comfort in ritual. The steady rhythm of prayer, the lighting of candles, the sound of a hymn, these became anchors, grounding people in something larger than themselves. Even as the plague tested their strength, medieval people carried faith like a lantern in the dark. Its light may not have driven away every shadow, but it offered a path to walk, steady and sure, guiding them through the uncertainty of each day. While most people of the Middle Ages lived in small villages and farmsteads, there were also the castles and towns, places where nobles, merchants, and craftsmen shaped their own rhythms of life. When the plague spread, these places, too, felt its quiet weight, though the response was often different from that of the countryside. Castles, with their thick stone walls and heavy gates, were seen by many nobles as sanctuaries. When word of the plague reached their lands, lords sometimes closed their gates, limiting the flow of travelers and guests. Within, life carried on with an air of guarded caution. The great halls were still lit by torches and warmed by the fire. Meals were still served at long wooden tables, but feasts grew smaller, and the laughter of visiting guests grew more rare. Servants continued their work, tending the kitchens, fetching water, caring for the horses in the stables. Yet they did so with a sense of watchfulness, mindful of each cough, each sign of illness. For those within the walls, safety felt stronger than in the villages, but the sense of separation also carried its own unease. A castle could keep out strangers, but it could not entirely keep out sickness. In the towns, life was different still. Streets wound tightly between timbered houses, with upper stories leaning close together as if whispering secrets. Markets, once lively with voices and colors, grew subdued. Some merchants closed their stalls, while others sold their goods quickly and quietly, eager to return to the safety of home. The sound of wagon wheels still clattered on cobblestones, but there were fewer of them now, and the echoes seemed to linger longer in the narrowing streets. For wealthy merchants, life carried its own blend of caution and resilience. Some families withdrew to country houses, hoping distance would shield them. Others stayed, continuing their trade, their wealth allowing them to purchase herbs, fine cloths, or even the advice of learned physicians. Letters were exchanged between towns, news passing of where the plague had struck, and where it was said to be fading. Even in cities, small comforts endured. Bakers still rose early, their ovens glowing with warm loaves. Cobblers worked steadily in their shops, the smell of leather rising in the air. Children, though more carefully watched, still played in alleyways, chasing one another beneath the shadow of tall church towers. Life was quieter, but it was not entirely still. Within the castle halls and the town squares alike, nobles and merchants sought to preserve order. Records were written, tithes collected, and disputes settled, even as illness spread outside their doors. Authority, whether noble or civic, became not only a matter of governance but also of reassurance, a steady hand upon the wheel in uncertain waters. For both lords and townsfolk, the plague was not only a threat to life but a test of continuity. Could traditions, duties, and routines endure even as shadows lengthened? And in most cases, the answer was yes. Life, though altered, found ways to move forward, quieter, slower, but still alive with the sound of footsteps on stone floors and the steady rhythm of daily tasks. Inside castles and towns, as in the villages, the Black Death was not always met with panic, but often with adaptation. People adjusted their habits, sought safety where they could, and leaned on the familiar structures of work, faith, and family. The noble in his hall, the merchant in his shop, the craftsman at his bench, each faced the same unseen shadow, and each, in their own way, carried on. Even in the shadow of the plague, life did not lose all of its light. Families and neighbors found quiet ways to keep hope alive, turning to the oldest forms of comfort, to song, to story, and to the simple presence of one another. In cottages, when work in the fields was done and the sun had slipped below the horizon, families gathered close around the hearth. The fire, small though it may have been, cast a warm glow across worn wooden beams. The crackle of kindling became a gentle rhythm, a backdrop against which voices would rise. Fathers told stories of saints, of brave knights, or of ancestors whose names still lingered in memory. Mothers taught their children songs, some meant to soothe, some meant to remember. These were not grand tales, but steady ones, the kind that lulled minds into calm, especially on nights when the world outside felt uncertain. Music, too, was a source of resilience. Even a simple flute or the plucking of strings on a lute could fill a room with softness. Children hummed along, while elders nodded slowly to the tune, letting it wash over them like the familiar sound of rain upon a roof. In towns and villages, musicians sometimes wandered from door to door, offering their songs in exchange for bread or shelter. Their melodies lingered in the air long after they had gone, weaving into the memory of those who listened. Neighbors, when they could, shared these moments together. A story told by one would be passed along to another household, like a candle lighting another flame. A song sung in one cottage might drift into the next, carried by the night air. These small acts of sharing stitched together a fragile but enduring sense of community. Children, too, found ways to bring joy. With games played in the yard or stories acted out with sticks and scraps of cloth, they reminded their parents of laughter, however fleeting. Their voices, rising above the heaviness of the time, carried a kind of innocence that even the plague could not silence. For many, storytelling was not just entertainment, it was preservation. Through tales, people passed down their understanding of the world, their history, and their beliefs. In the quiet repetition of these words, listeners found not only distraction, but a deep connection to those who had come before. Each story was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one that stretched across generations. It was in these quiet, shared rituals that resilience was born. Not in great battles or grand gestures, but in the steady pulse of ordinary life, the warmth of a fire, the sound of a familiar melody, the comfort of sitting shoulder to shoulder with loved ones. Though the plague was an ever-present shadow, it could not extinguish the small lights that glowed within homes and hearts. And in those moments of laughter, of prayer, of song, medieval people discovered that endurance was not always loud or heroic. Sometimes it was simply the act of being together and choosing each day to carry on. As the years passed and the plague slowly loosened its hold, the world of the Middle Ages did not return exactly to what it had been before. Life went on, yes, but it carried quiet changes, subtle shifts that left their mark for generations to come. One of the most lasting effects was the way people thought about community and survival. Entire villages had been thinned, and in some places, whole hamlets disappeared. Yet this also meant that land became more available, and the peasants who remained often found themselves with greater opportunities. Fields that had once been crowded with laborers now stood open, and the value of each worker's hands grew stronger. For some families, this brought a quiet improvement in their lives. Better wages, more freedom, and a voice that carried further than before. In towns, too, the changes were felt. Merchants and craftsmen who survived found fewer competitors, allowing their trades to grow. Markets, once hushed during the height of the plague, slowly filled again with the sound of bargaining voices and the smell of bread, cloth, and spices. These places carried the memory of emptiness, yet they also reflected a spirit of renewal, a cautious return to rhythm. The church, long the center of medieval life, also carried the marks of the plague. Many had sought comfort in prayer during those years, but some questioned why the sickness had spread so widely despite so many devotions. This did not mean faith disappeared. Far from it. Instead, it shifted, opening space for new forms of worship, for personal devotion at home, and for different ways of seeking meaning. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, seeds of change were planted, ones that would shape later centuries. Families, too, carried lessons from that time. The bonds formed during long nights of storytelling and shared meals lingered even after the shadow had passed. People learned the value of simple comforts, the closeness of kin, the sound of music, the small rituals of daily life that gave strength in hard times. These lessons, though not written in books, lived on in memory, passed down from parent to child in the rhythms of home and hearth. And perhaps the greatest reflection of all was this, that even in the presence of loss and uncertainty, life had endured. The plow still turned the soil, bells still rang across quiet fields, and fires still glowed in hearths at the day's end. The plague had reshaped the world, but it had not stilled it. For those who lived through it and for those who came after, the story of the Black Death was not only one of suffering, but also one of resilience. It was a reminder, whispered through time, that humanity has always found ways to carry on, not through grand triumphs alone, but through the gentle persistence of everyday life. And so, our quiet journey through the time of the Black Death comes to an end. We have wandered softly through medieval villages, where families gathered close in the flicker of firelight. We have listened to the footsteps of peasants in the fields, to the hushed prayers in stone churches, and to the tender melodies of music carried through the night. Together, we have seen not only the shadow of the plague, but also the light that endured in laughter, in song, and in the quiet strength of ordinary life. As you rest now, perhaps you can imagine yourself in that world long ago, the gentle creak of timber beams above, the warmth of the hearth beside you, the hush of night wrapping the village in stillness. Outside, the wind drifts through the trees, carrying the faint sound of bells across the valley. Inside, the calm remains. The people of that time, though they faced hardship, remind us that life endures through the smallest of moments. A shared story, a steady breath, the comfort of simply being. These two are with you now in this moment of rest. So let your eyes grow heavy, your breath fall into a slow rhythm, and your mind drift like a lantern upon still waters. The world will keep turning, as it always has, and you may surrender to sleep, knowing that resilience and quiet strength are as old as history itself. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle.